This happened a couple of years ago, and I think it's about time to get it off my chest. I was around 18 years old, and for a period of time I was very physically active. I had struggled with some bad habits brought by excessive partying, and exercise proved very helpful in this regard. I regularly went jogging around this time. Mind you, I lived in a small town in the ever-so-peaceful Scandinavia, out all by myself jogging in the woods. Not a soul in sight, right? So my class didn't start until around noon or so I went out for a little morning jog, broad daylight and everything. I went on my bike to the tracks and left my bike at the jogging station. I don't really know what else to call it. It was sort of a small red cottage where different outdoors clubs would hang out together. As I was about to enter the tracks, I realized there were two middle-aged men sitting by the cottage. I glanced at them only to find myself locking eyes with one. The way he looked at me was deeply unsettling. It was only for a brief moment, but I'll never forget how I felt when his eyes just kind of pierced right through me. My gut was making an honest effort to tell me that something was off about this whole interaction. These men were wearing jeans and leather jackets, so they sure as hell weren't there for the sake of exercising. I brushed it off though, thinking I was surely overreacting. I was wrong. I had only been jogging for a couple of minutes when I suddenly felt the need to turn around, and there they were, in a white minivan, following me on the tracks. I could feel that man's devilish gaze on me again. Oh no. I was doing my best trying to think of a logical, non-threatening reason for them to be following me. I couldn't really think of one that made sense. Now I'm just trying to work out what on earth I was going to do. Obviously, I didn't want to make it clear to them that I was downright terrified. If I started running as fast as I could, I would just be turning myself into prey. It's not like anyone else was there to help either. Not a single person. It wouldn't matter how loud I screamed. Fortunately for me, I'd been on these tracks a fair number of times, so I knew there was going to be a sharp curve not that far ahead. I tried to act as if I was not in the least bit bothered by this whole situation. As soon as I passed by that curb, though, and I was out of their vision for a short while, I sprinted out into the woods as if my life depended on it and hid behind a small rock. I was crouching down as I saw the white vehicle slowly pass through that sharp curve. Soon they were out of my sight, but I didn't dare to move yet. I knew that when they passed by that curb and noticed I was nowhere to be seen, they'd know I'd run off and hid somewhere. After the curve, the trail was a straight line for quite some time, so they'd also know I was not on the tracks anymore. I stayed put, thinking that if they truly were after me, of course they would come back. If I was just overreacting, they'd carry on doing whatever they were doing, and I would never see them again. But the white van did come back. At this point, my memory is a bit vague. I wouldn't even breathe, dreading that the slightest movement would give me away. I can't fully remember if the van stopped and the dominant man stepped outside, or if they simply passed by slowly looking for me. What I do vividly remember, though, is when that little van went back where it came from. I was somewhat relieved, but also still a bit worried. Thing is, all the tracks led back to that cottage where these men were most likely to go. I then decided to carry on deeper into the woods, glancing over my shoulder every now and then to make sure no one was following me. My sense of direction is somewhat okay when I'm in the forest for some reason. I'm pretty much useless otherwise. Anyway, I knew that there would be a highway if I kept going a bit further. I reached the highway and started to walk home from there. It usually takes a half hour walking from where I live to the tracks, but the journey back took about 3 to 4. It was totally worth it though. I don't think I ever went back to pick up my bike. I don't know fully what intentions those men had for me that day, but I certainly don't believe they could have been any good, and I don't know what was in that van either. I've never really shared this experience with anyone except my mom, a few close friends, and my boyfriend. but I don't think they realize just how much this still impacts me. I worked a fairly entry-level office job in a mixed commercial/industrial area in my community. Because of the nature of most of the work in that area, mostly manufacturing and construction-type jobs, it wasn't uncommon to see people walking around in canvas pants covered in oil and being a little bit dingy looking. I carpooled with my mom since she worked nearby, and this particular day, my mom had called me to tell me she was going to be about a half hour late to pick me up. Instead of waiting at my work for her, though, I decided I would simply walk to the coffee shop nearby and wait there for her. It was late in the afternoon, 4 p.m. or so quite quiet. I was the only customer in the shop when I sat down at a table to read a newspaper. A few minutes after doing so, though, this very handsome middle-aged man walked in just behind me. He was very attractive and had a very comfortable charm to him. What really struck me, though, was how clean he looked for the area, especially since he was wearing coveralls and work boots. I didn't really think too much of it at first, honestly, so when he asked me if he could sit down with me and chat while he waited for his own ride, I said okay. We actually had a fairly nice conversation for a little while, until he started asking personal questions about me. They weren't particularly specific or anything, but in hindsight it was quite strange. At the time though, I thought perhaps it was just naivete or something. I kept talking even though I started to get a really strange vibe the more I interacted with him. I started to get really uncomfortable though when I asked him what he did for a living. He told me he had worked at a manufacturing place nearby, and he had been working there for about a year or so. He then told me it was the first job he'd ever had, so he was really excited about continuing his career there. Remember, this guy was middle-aged. Not only was it what he said, but how he said it. It struck me as so odd. That became my first bold and waving red flag to get out of there. I instantly had a moment where I thought to myself, what middle-aged man is only 1 year into his very first job, especially in an area that can't really be shrugged off as prolonged education, rich parents? To me, that screamed recent prison release. On top of that, for him to be so clean despite him saying where he worked, it just wasn't adding up. Immediately, I started texting my mom under the table and said I was really uncomfortable and she needed to come ASAP. I continued to interact with the man like nothing was weird, but deep down I was really regretting telling him all that stuff about me in case he decided to follow me. When my mom pulled into the parking lot, I quickly rushed out of there and hopped in the car. As she pulled out, I saw him leave the shop immediately and hop into his own. Now, remember, in our conversation, he'd told me he was waiting for his own ride. If I had been paying attention to him as he came in, I would have realized that was a lie right away. He'd driven there himself, and specifically waited with me until my ride arrived. Obviously, I was really freaking out now. I quickly explained to my mom what was going on, and she sped off down the street. I looked behind us, and guess who was there? That guy following in his car. She purposely ducked and dove down all sorts of bizarre streets and went in circle after circle. He followed us for 30 minutes before finally giving up. I don't know why I didn't report that experience to the police. I was just so shocked something like that would happen. I went on with my life and shook it off as a one-off occurrence. Fast forward about a week, and my mom picks up a newspaper, only to find that on the front page there was a picture of that one and only very handsome man. Turns out he had kidnapped a woman and shoved her into the trunk of her own car. He drove her while she was in the trunk about 200 miles to another city. He then forced her to take all her money out of her bank account and abandoned her there with no wallet and no vehicle. If not for my mom, I could have been so screwed that day. Fortunately, the woman was not physically injured or sexually assaulted, but I can't begin to imagine spending hours in the trunk of your own car, not knowing what was going to happen to you. It's been about 7 years since this happened, and I still have some serious trust issues with strangers. I didn't work in that area much longer. It became too difficult for me. While I did work there, I had previously gone to that particular shop daily during my lunch breaks. and still, to this very day, I've never been back there. I didn't really realize how messed up and creepy this was at the time, because everybody was telling me to brush it off, kind of. Anyway, on to the story. When I was around 15, I got my first job in my tiny rural town at an artisanal tea shop. Once the summer months rolled around, my job became working an iced tea stand outside. It wasn't a bad gig at all, but it did inspire a lot of irritating and perhaps slightly creepy individuals to talk to me for prolonged periods of time. One day, this scruffy guy who seemed a bit off wandered over to my tea stand and started chatting with me. I kept trying to steer the conversations towards him buying something, but it seemed he was only concerned with talking to me. We'll call this man Tom. Of course, he started with asking me how old I am, where I went to school, my name. As I was still young at the time and very naive, I told him, trying to be friendly. Tom then proceeded to dump on me his entire life story. He told me how he was in his early 30s and his girlfriend had died. He'd overdosed on heroin on a bathroom floor. No exaggeration, he stood there for hours and hours, going into detail until my boss had to come out and tell my friend to leave. I was definitely put off, but I really thought it was more sad than anything else. The next day at work, though, Tom came back to my job. The moment I saw him, my stomach started turning. Great, another day of being annoyed. Tom immediately pulled out this 10-page handwritten love letter, though, that he'd apparently written for me overnight. I began to read through, but it was mostly just literary porn. He continued to tell me he'd never met anyone like me, and how I wasn't tainted by the world yet. This guy flat out told me I was his angel sent from heaven. Wow, great. The next few days, Tom came back every day I worked with an even longer letter. Eventually, I just began throwing them out altogether, or refusing to take them. My boss even had to step in and tell him he was not welcome there anymore. If this was where everything had ended, I probably wouldn't even remember him anymore. When he lost his chance to contact me while I was working, though, he somehow found me and started messaging me on Facebook. I recently looked back at some of those messages he'd sent me. One in particular was this fictional story he'd written about me. The conclusion was basically that he'd decided I was too beautiful to exist. My existence itself was torturing him, and so he was going to kill me. I would block his account, and he would make new ones constantly, messaging me poems, stories, letters, all of these things. After a while, he must have gotten sick of me telling him to fuck off, because he eventually did stop messaging me. Fast forward to about a year and a half later. I'm 17 now and working at a dingy restaurant in the same old town. It was a very laid-back job, and I got along well with all of my coworkers. One day, though, to my dismay, I saw Tom walk right through the door. I kid you not, I saw his whole face light up with glee the moment he saw me. I'm surprised he didn't see the horror written all over mine. Again, he ran straight to me. He didn't even buy anything. Just immediately started saying how I still looked like an angel. I think he found me working there by accident, but once he did figure it out, he did not give up. He started coming back every single day again, and messaging me on Facebook too. I couldn't believe he was still doing this. Luckily, one coworker I was close with, Max, started to pick up on my vibe when this guy was coming in. He ended up telling me he went to high school with him, and he'd been in trouble for stalking more than just one girl. He also had a fairly large amount of drug issues. Basically, this guy was bad news. The next time Tom came in, there happened to be nobody else in the restaurant, so Max told him not so subtly to get out and never come back. I guess he was fairly intimidated because he never did. To this day, though, Tom will still occasionally message me on Facebook from a blank account. He tells me how much I'm torturing him. I'm not sure if he ever had any real intent to kill me or anything, but for my sake and the sake of my sanity, I hope I never run into him again. Oh, by the way, I did go to the cops when it first started. They knew who he was pretty much immediately, but told me there was nothing they could do until he actually did something. Basically, they just told me to stay away from him, as if I wasn't trying already. Let me clarify. This happened during my college's Halloween celebration a few years ago, and is still the most terrifying experience of my life. One of my roommates, some friends, and myself left to go to a party right around dusk or so. We were catcalled by a group of 3 drifters/homeless people. We didn't really think anything of it and went on our merry way. That sort of thing happens all the time. About 4 hours later, we were going back to our apartment to change our shoes. High heels and messed up streets are absolute hell when you've been out drinking. The drifters were apparently still around though. One of them called out to me, "Hey there, beautiful, how about a kiss?" Me being a little drunk and sassy, I snapped back, "No thanks, girls are more my type." To my shock and horror, the man smirked and said, "Hey, my friend here likes the ladies too." A homeless girl came out of nowhere and proceeded to kiss me right on the mouth. My friend picked me up and basically threw me over his shoulder to get me out of there. Of course, I flipped the fuck out in my apartment, but eventually I shrugged it off and we ventured back out to have some more fun. Well, unfortunately, I got separated from my group in the crowd, and at that exact moment, I saw those 3 drifters again. I tried not to show that I was shitting bricks when they asked me where they could find a liquor store. I pointed down the street to the Kroger, but they said, "Alright, you can show us then." I'm a small woman. They easily grabbed me and shoved me into their vehicle. I thought naively at the time, and perhaps drunkly, that they would literally let me out at the grocery store, except it was closed because it was well after midnight. As I started to realize this, I pled for them to let me out of the car. They just kept on saying, "The power does what it wants." They headed away from the safety of the campus area, out onto the freeway, and out of the state. For the next 4 hours, I visited 3 different states with them, all while pleading for my life. I'll never forget how they kept chanting that slogan, talking about how much fun they were going to have with me. I kind of resigned myself to the fact that I was probably going to die. I would never graduate college or see my family ever again. They pulled into a gas station though, and I slipped out of the vehicle, only to be grabbed again before I could completely get out. Still though, it gave me an opportunity to scream my head off to the clerk for help. That's when they talked about taking me to the cliff. I mentioned that my family was full of police officers, and they were probably already out looking for me. They were committing a federal crime, and I wouldn't press charges if they just took me back to campus. I guess that's when the girl started to feel a bit sorry for me, because she started to say, "Guys, she's really scared. Maybe we should just drop her off somewhere or something. This doesn't have to get any worse." They did take me back to the campus area, and as soon as the girl pulled me out of the car, a police officer called my name. The girl shoved me toward the cop and yelled out once more, "The power does what it wants, and tonight it lets you live." I'd never been so happy to sit in a cruiser. They pursued the people, but I don't know if they were ever caught. My roommate dropped out of college and joined the military, and I transferred to another school. I guess the moral of the story is be careful walking at night. Always keep your cell phone with you if possible, and call the police if you see suspicious people lingering around. I had a brush with death that day, and I'm grateful for the time I have now. Halloween has unfortunately never been a big deal out here in Scotland. That's always sort of bummed me out because I really love Halloween. After this year though, I think I'll be happy never celebrating again. My street and the next street over have a lot of young kids who go out trick-or-treating, so while I was out shopping all day with my mom, we decided to pick up some sweets just in case anyone stopped by our door. I had plans to go to the cinema to see Ouija with my boyfriend, so when I got home, I was getting myself ready to go out. My mom was busy putting the shopping away, so when the first load of kids came to the door, I was the one who had to answer. There were children from our street, the next one over, and some I couldn't recognize. There was also an adult at the very end of the path. I guess they were either a father or perhaps an older brother based on their size. They were dressed all in black and had some sort of mask covering their face, but it wasn't from anything I recognized like a movie or anything. Anyway, they all told me their jokes and I gave them their treats. They made their way back down the path and on to the next house. I was just about to close the door when I noticed that guy who'd come with the kids was still standing there at the end of my path. He hadn't noticed I'd seen him, and he wasn't watching the children either. He was just sort of looking right at me. My skin started to crawl when I realized he was standing there staring at me. I backed slowly into the house and watched as he raised his hand and waved very slowly at me. I was about to call out to him when my mom came to the door to make sure I was all right. He took off in the opposite direction of the children. He hadn't been with them at all. He'd left as soon as he realized I was not home alone. I was completely freaked out, needless to say. I told my boyfriend all about it when he came to the house to pick me up. I quickly forgot though as we went on our date and watched the movie together. When I finally got home, it was getting really late, and trick-or-treating was well and truly over around these parts. When I got inside, my mom was just getting ready to take the dogs out for a walk so they could do their last-minute business. They would meet my dad on his way home from work, so now I really was going to be home alone. After another horrible encounter I've already shared, I don't really like being home alone. It's even worse on Halloween though, and always has been. Anyway, I was now alone. I grabbed some snacks and went up to my bedroom and onto my computer so I could do some writing, scroll through my Tumblr, and perhaps listen to some music. After that other creepy encounter I mentioned with some guys coming into my house and into my backyard, my dad had bought a motion sensor light and attached it to the wall of our house right outside my window. Normally, it would only go off whenever a cat walked along our fence or something, but it would usually just turn off after a couple of minutes. I always know when the light has come on too, because it lights up my whole room given where it's placed. While I was sitting there at my computer, the light suddenly turned on. I ignored it at first because I knew it would turn off soon enough, but 5 minutes passed by and it still was on. I opened my blinds to have a look outside and see what was going on. My stomach almost fell out of my ass when I looked out and saw that creep from hours before sitting on the fence, waving at my window to keep the light on. His waving slowed down suddenly when he spotted me. It was all seriously creepy again, and I didn't know what to do. Luckily, I heard the front door open and my parents coming into the house with the dogs. I rushed down the stairs and started screaming at them about the guy on the fence. My dad didn't even question me. He took the dogs and rushed out of the house. He threw the back door open and ran outside. Then I heard him shouting, "You get the fuck out of here, you creep! I'm gonna call the police!" My dad scared him off luckily, but I convinced him not to call the cops because I didn't want to relive all that stuff again. I just wanted to go to sleep and forget all about that whole night.